The wind that swept through Red Willow carried the scent of dust and sage, curling around the small sagging cabin at the edge of the McAllister ranch. Inside, Clara Hayes stirred a pot of stew over the fire, her worn hands moving with quiet precision. Her two small children slept in the corner beneath a quilt so patched it told the story of every hard winter they'd survived. Clara had been a widow for 2 years now. 2 long, bone-tired years since her husband, Thomas, had been crushed under a falling beam during a cattle drive. He'd died working for the McAllisters, leaving Clara with a debt she could never repay and a loneliness she'd never asked for. But it wasn't guilt that drew her to their ranch each day. It was gratitude. When Thomas died, Mrs. McAllister, Luke's mother, had sent food to Clara's door for weeks. No one else in town had come near her then. Pity was scarce for a poor young widow. So when Clara heard last spring that Mrs. McAllister had fallen ill and Luke had gone off to the city to manage his business empire, she knew what she had to do. She began walking the dusty trail to the McAllister house before dawn, leaving before anyone could see her. Each morning she'd clean, cook, and tend to the old couple as if they were her own parents. She boiled herbs for the old man's chest cough, read aloud from the Bible when Mrs. McAllister couldn't sleep, and mended their clothes by the light of a flickering lantern. She never took a cent. In fact, she refused it when the ranch hand tried to slip her coins in secret. "This isn't for money," she'd whispered, shaking her head. "It's for what they once did for me." To the McAllisters, she became a quiet blessing. To the town, she remained invisible. The only proof of her kindness was the steady recovery of the ranch's old folk. The house that had once echoed with silence now smelled of bread and lavender, and laughter returned to the porch when the weather allowed. Yet Clara kept her secret fiercely guarded. She knew how townsfolk talked, how quick they were to twist a good deed into something shameful. "The widow's too proud," they'd say, "too close to the McAllister place." She couldn't afford the whispering, not with 2 children to raise and a reputation that already hung by a thread. So each afternoon, when the sun slid behind the red hills, she would wash her hands, put her shawl over her head, and vanish down the back path before the evening riders passed. By the time the first stars appeared, she'd be home again, rocking her baby to sleep, telling herself she'd done enough good to make her husband proud. Still, some nights, when the wind howled against the shutters, Clara felt a strange ache in her chest, a longing not just for what she'd lost, but for something she couldn't name. It wasn't love exactly, nor hope. It was the quiet wish that someone someday might see her, not as a burden, not as a widow, but as a woman who'd done her best in a world that often looked away. And far away, beyond the hills she crossed each morning, the man who owned the ranch she served, Luke McAllister, millionaire and heir to the land her husband died working, had no idea that a widow's gentle hands were keeping his parents alive, or that her secret devotion would soon turn both their lives upside down. The sun had barely lifted over the hills when a dark stallion appeared on the horizon, its rider cloaked in trail dust and silence. Luke McAllister had returned to Red Willow after nearly 3 years away. The townsfolk spotted him from afar, his tall frame, his fine coat, the glint of city polish that seemed out of place against the rugged plains. To most, Luke was a legend wrapped in rumors, the millionaire rancher who'd turned his father's modest land into a cattle empire, the man who left town chasing bigger fortunes. But to himself, Luke was simply tired of deals, of polite lies, of the loneliness that came with having everything money could buy except peace. His last letter from home had been brief. "Your mother's been ill again. We're managing." That was months ago. He hadn't realized how heavy guilt could grow until now, riding through the gate of the ranch that raised him. The house looked smaller than he remembered, weathered but tidy. The porch rail had been mended, the curtains washed, and the smell of stew drifted from the kitchen. It surprised him. He'd left it in the hands of a caretaker who hadn't lasted long before quitting. He dismounted quietly, half expecting to find his parents bedridden. Instead, his father sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in a quilt, humming a tune. "Luke?" The old man's eyes widened, voice breaking. "Son, I thought we'd see you by Christmas." Luke knelt beside him, taking in the color in his father's cheeks, the light in his eyes. He'd expected frailty. What he saw was life. His mother appeared at the doorway, frail but smiling, her gray hair pinned neatly under her shawl. "You came home?" she said softly, and though her voice trembled, her hands were strong as they reached for him. "I did," Luke said, overwhelmed. "I thought you were, well, worse off." His mother chuckled, glancing toward the kitchen. "We've had help. A good soul who's been tending to us while you've been gone." Luke frowned. "Help? Who? I left the ranch empty after the last nurse left." "She came on her own," his mother said simply. "Didn't want her name known. Said kindness didn't need an audience." That night, as Luke sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the thought. The dishes were clean, the beds freshly made, and there was a vase of wildflowers on the table, small touches his mother hadn't been able to do for years. Whoever this mysterious woman was, she'd cared for them better than any hired nurse. Luke asked around quietly. The ranch hand shrugged. "Don't rightly know her name, sir. She comes early, leaves before sunup. Always says she ain't doing it for pay." Something about that unsettled Luke. No one helped for nothing. Not in Red Willow. He started rising earlier, determined to catch a glimpse of this caretaker. But each morning the porch was empty, the paths swept clean. Only faint footprints remained in the dust leading toward the creek trail, the one that wound past the old Hayes cabin. The name stirred a faint memory. Thomas Hayes, the ranch hand who died years ago in a stable accident. Luke remembered sending a small compensation to the widow afterward. He wondered if she still lived out there, surviving somehow. That night, he watched his parents doze peacefully by the hearth, both whispering prayers for the angel who visited them. Luke stood in the doorway, the firelight flickering over his face, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than control or success. He felt curiosity, gratitude, and an odd stirring in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but by morning, that curiosity would lead him straight to the woman who'd been quietly saving everything he thought he'd lost. The morning mist lay heavy over the McAllister ranch when Luke rose before dawn, determined to uncover the mystery. He saddled his horse in silence, the leather creaking softly as the first pale light touched the horizon. A chill hung in the air, biting through his city coat, but he hardly felt it. All night, he'd thought about his parents' mysterious caretaker, the unseen woman who came and went like a ghost. He waited behind the barn, hidden by the fence line, his breath forming faint clouds. The house was still, except for the flicker of a lamp in the kitchen window. Then, through the dim light, a small figure appeared. A woman wrapped in a faded shawl, balancing a pail in one hand and a basket in the other. She moved quietly, with purpose, her boots whispering against the frosted grass. Luke's heart quickened. She wasn't some hired hand. Her movements were too gentle, too familiar. He watched as she checked the door latch, glancing back once as if afraid to be seen. Then she turned down the trail toward the creek, disappearing into the thinning fog. Without thinking, Luke followed. The path wound between willow trees and wild sage. Her footprints were small but steady, pressed into the soft earth. He kept his distance, not wanting to frighten her. When she reached the old bridge, she stopped to adjust her basket. That's when he finally saw her face, clear in the golden wash of sunrise. It was Clara Hayes. The recognition hit him like a stone. He remembered her from years ago, the quiet wife of Thomas Hayes, one of his best hands. He'd attended Thomas's funeral briefly, offered condolences he now realized were hollow, and left town soon after. He hadn't seen Clara since. He'd assumed she'd moved away or remarried. But here she was, thinner now, with lines of weariness around her eyes, yet with a grace that no hardship could erase. For a moment, Luke simply watched. She crossed the field toward her small cabin, her shawl fluttering behind her like a flag of endurance. The children's laughter carried faintly through the air, her two little ones running out to greet her. She knelt to embrace them, her smile lighting her tired face, and Luke felt something shift inside him. This woman had been feeding and caring for his parents while raising her own children on scraps. And she'd done it without ever asking for recognition, payment, or favor. His chest tightened with guilt. He'd been so far away, chasing fortune, while she'd quietly held together the pieces of what he'd neglected. He rode back slowly, his thoughts heavy. That evening, when he entered the kitchen, his mother noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "You found her, haven't you?" she said softly, stirring a pot. Luke blinked. "You knew?" "I guessed," she replied. "She didn't want you to. Said it might embarrass you, a rich man being indebted to a poor widow." Luke clenched his jaw, shame and admiration mingling in his chest. "She saved your lives, Ma, and she did it in secret." "Why?" His mother smiled faintly. "Because real kindness doesn't need to be seen, son." That night, Luke couldn't sleep. He walked to the porch and looked out toward the faint lights of the Hayes cabin flickering in the distance. Somewhere in that little house was the woman who had given his parents comfort when he hadn't. He made a silent vow then that come morning, he'd speak to her himself. But he had no idea that their meeting would stir more than gratitude, that in confronting her humility, he'd soon be forced to confront his own heart. The next morning broke golden and still, the kind of quiet dawn that made Red Willow seem half asleep. Luke McAllister rose early, his resolve hardened through a sleepless night. He had spent hours replaying what he'd seen, the widow's humble cabin, her children's laughter, the basket of bread she carried for his parents. Each image carved a sharper edge into his conscience. By the time the sun tipped over the ridge, he was already riding toward the Hayes place. The trail was narrow, lined with dry grass and mesquite. When the cabin came into view, it looked even smaller than he remembered, its roof sagging, smoke rising from the crooked chimney. Outside, Clara knelt beside a wooden tub, scrubbing clothes with raw, reddened hands. For a moment, Luke hesitated. He had faced business rivals, cattle thieves, and harsh winters. But somehow, facing this woman felt harder. He cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Hayes." Clara froze, her back stiffening before she slowly looked up. Her eyes, gray as morning mist, widened in shock. The washcloth slipped from her fingers. "Mr. McAllister?" she whispered. "I think we need to talk," Luke said gently, stepping closer. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "If it's about your folks, I meant no harm. I just couldn't stand by when I heard they were struggling." Luke shook his head. "No harm? You've done more for them than anyone else ever could. But why in secret? You could have come to me." "I would have paid me?" Her tone was sharp, her chin lifting. "I didn't do it for money, sir. I did it because your mother once sat by my husband's bedside when no one else would. Because she sent food when my children were hungry. I owed her kindness, not a debt." Luke blinked, taken aback by the steel in her voice. "Still, you shouldn't have carried that burden alone. You've got children to raise, a life of your own." A flicker of irritation crossed her face. "A widow's life doesn't stop because it's heavy, Mr. McAllister. You learn to carry what's yours and a little more if someone needs it." Her words cut through him. Luke realized how long it had been since anyone had spoken to him without fear or flattery. In the city, people lowered their voices when he entered a room. But this woman, this widow in a patched dress, met his gaze as if he were no one special. He took a breath. "At least let me pay you for your time. For the food, the care." Clara shook her head. "No, you can't buy back what's freely given." She picked up the wet cloth again, her hands trembling slightly. "If I took your money, it would cheapen everything." Luke felt a surge of frustration, part pride, part shame. "You're too proud, Mrs. Hayes. And you're too used to fixing things with dollars," she shot back, meeting his gaze. "But not everything in this world is for sale." Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind rustling through the cottonwoods. Luke's jaw tightened, but behind his irritation was admiration, a reluctant respect for the courage in her eyes. Finally, he said quietly, "My mother speaks highly of you." "So do I. I only wish I'd known sooner." Clara's expression softened, but she turned away, wringing out the last piece of cloth. "You know now. That's enough." Luke lingered, wanting to say more, but sensing she'd built walls around herself for good reason. As he mounted his horse, she called out softly, "Tell your folks I'll stop by after supper as usual." He looked back at her, silhouetted by the morning sun, strong, tired, unyielding. And in that moment, Luke realized that pride wasn't the only thing standing between them. It was also the beginning of something far deeper, something neither of them was ready to name. Red Willow was a town that thrived on whispers. Its saloon, sewing circles, and Sunday pews were all fueled by one thing: talk. And it didn't take long for talk to start once someone saw Luke McAllister riding toward the widow's cabin 3 mornings in a row. At first, it was harmless curiosity. "Maybe he's paying her for work," the blacksmith said. But by the end of the week, the whispers had soured. "A rich man visiting a poor widow's cabin?" Someone muttered at the general store. "Doesn't look right." Clara felt the shift before she heard the words. When she walked into town with her basket of bread, conversation would quiet. Women she'd known for years pretended to browse shelves rather than meet her eyes. The butcher's wife, once kind to her, turned her back entirely. At first, she ignored it. She had learned long ago that a woman's reputation in a place like Red Willow was fragile as glass, especially a widow's. Still, the cold glances stung. Every night she'd tuck her children in, pretending not to notice the tension growing around them. One afternoon, she arrived at the McAllister ranch with her usual modest meal, fresh soup, biscuits, and tea for the old couple. But when she stepped onto the porch, she saw Luke standing there with a tight expression. "Clara," he said softly, using her first name for the first time, "I need to warn you, folks are talking." Her brow furrowed. "Talking?" He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "About you, about me. About how much time you spend here. They're twisting what's good into something ugly." Clara's face paled, but her chin lifted. "And what will you do, Mr. McAllister? Buy their silence too?" He shook his head. "No, I won't buy anything. But I won't let anyone dishonor you either." Later that evening, when Luke walked into the saloon to collect supplies, the murmuring stopped. Every eye followed him. He set his hat on the counter and said clearly, "Anyone with something to say about Mrs. Hayes can say it to me." The room went still. No one dared. Luke's words spread through town like wildfire, half admired, half condemned. Some said it was gallantry. Others called it foolishness. But by defending her so publicly, he had only thrown fuel on the gossip. That night, Clara came to his porch again, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The moon hung pale above them, washing the yard in silver light. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "You think you helped me, but you didn't." "I couldn't stand by," Luke replied. "You've done nothing wrong." "That doesn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "In a town like this, it's not truth that decides a woman's worth. It's what people choose to believe." Luke looked at her then, not as a rancher or a man of wealth, but as someone seeing another person's pain for the first time. "Let them talk," he said finally. "I know who you are," Clara's eyes glistened. "And that's kind, Mr. McAllister, but your name will recover. Mine won't." For a long moment they stood in silence, the only sound the chirp of crickets and the faint creak of the porch boards. Luke wanted to promise her protection, but he understood now that words wouldn't fix this. What she needed wasn't pity, it was respect. As she turned to leave, he said softly, "Then I'll make them see what I see." She paused but didn't answer. The wind tugged at her shawl as she walked down the path, her figure fading into the silver dusk. And for the first time, Luke realized that in Red Willow, doing what was right sometimes meant losing everything you thought you could control. Autumn rolled into Red Willow with a restless wind and the first whispers of fever. It started as a cough among ranch hands, then spread through town like wildfire. By the time the first snow dusted the hills, half the valley was down with sickness, and Mrs. McAllister, Luke's mother, had taken to her bed again. Luke stood helpless at her bedside, watching the woman who'd raised him fade beneath the fever's heat. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her hands trembled when she tried to lift her cup. The doctor from town rode out once, left a bottle of bitter tonic, and shook his head. "Best you can do is keep her cool and pray," he'd said before disappearing down the trail. But prayer alone wasn't enough for Clara Hayes. When she heard the news from a ranch hand, she didn't hesitate. By evening, she was at the McAllister house again, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Luke met her at the door, exhaustion etched deep into his face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his tone held no conviction. "The fever's bad." "I've nursed worse," she replied simply, setting down her basket of herbs and cloths. "Step aside, Mr. McAllister." He did. All that night and into the next day, Clara moved through the sick room with the patience of someone who knew suffering intimately. She sponged Mrs. McAllister's forehead, murmured gentle words, and brewed steaming tea that filled the air with lavender and thyme. Luke sat silently in the corner, watching her hands work. Steady, tender, sure. Once, when the fever broke briefly, his mother whispered, "Luke, you mind this woman?" "She's heaven-sent," Clara smiled faintly. "No, ma'am. Just stubborn." For days, the two worked side by side. Luke fetched water, chopped wood, did what he could under Clara's soft command. He'd never taken orders from anyone without protest, but when she asked, he obeyed without thought. Her quiet authority steadied him. Her calm gave him strength. Sometimes, in the late hours when the old woman slept, Luke and Clara would sit together by the hearth, too tired to speak. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and shadow. He noticed how the weariness softened her features, how the years of hardship had shaped not just her hands, but her heart. "Why do you do this?" he asked one night, his voice low. "You've given so much already. You don't owe us more." Clara looked into the flames, her expression unreadable. "When you've lost what I have, you stop counting what's owed. You just help where you can, while you can." Luke's throat tightened. "You've carried more kindness than most men could dream of repaying." She glanced at him, her eyes catching the firelight. "Then don't repay it. Just remember it." Their words hung between them, gentle, heavy, unfinished. By the 5th day, the fever broke completely. Mrs. McAllister's color returned. Her breathing deepened, and by week's end, she could sit up and smile. Luke stood beside Clara on the porch that evening, watching the sunset spill red across the hills. The air smelled of pine and smoke. For the first time in weeks, peace settled over the ranch. "My mother will live," Luke said softly. Clara nodded. "She's strong. Always was." He turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "So are you." She looked away quickly, hiding the tremor in her smile. "Strong doesn't mean unbreakable, Mr. McAllister." Luke wanted to reach for her then, to thank her, to promise something he couldn't yet name, but the words tangled in his chest. All he could do was watch as she gathered her shawl and walked down the path into the fading light. And though the fever had finally left his mother's body, Luke realized something else had begun to stir within his own heart, a warmth that no winter could freeze. The fever left the McAllister ranch quieter than before. The wind blew softer, the days stretched longer, and in the stillness, something unspoken began to grow between Luke and Clara. What had started as duty, her care for his mother, his gratitude was slowly changing into something deeper, though neither dared name it. For the first time in years, Luke didn't ride to town or think about his businesses. He stayed close to the ranch, fixing fences, mending saddles, or simply sitting on the porch beside Clara when she came to visit his parents. She never stayed long, never let herself linger too comfortably. But Luke noticed that each day she lingered just a little longer. One evening, after supper, the sky bled orange and pink across the plains. Luke's parents had gone to rest early, leaving the two of them alone by the fire. Clara sat at the edge of the porch, sewing a tear in her shawl. Luke stood nearby, leaning against the post, watching the last of the sun fade over the hills. "You've given them life again," he said quietly. You gave me back my family. Clara didn't look up. They were never gone, Mr. McAllister. You just stopped looking. Her words hit softly, but true. He turned toward her. You're right. I thought success would make me proud of myself, but all it did was make me lonely. I didn't even realize what I'd lost until I came home. Clara's hand stilled in her lap. You came back in time. That's what matters. Luke shook his head. No, Clara, I came back too late. I should have been here when they needed me most. When... He paused, his throat tight. When you were here carrying all of it alone. She looked up then, and their eyes met in the glow of the fire. There was no accusation in her gaze, only quiet understanding. We all carry our own sorrows, Luke, she said softly. Yours took you away. Mine kept me here. He moved closer, lowering himself to sit beside her. The night was cool, the scent of pine and smoke drifting between them. For a long moment, they said nothing. The silence felt safe, like a secret neither of them wanted to break. Finally, Clara spoke again, her voice low. When Thomas died, I thought my life had ended too. But your mother, she showed me grace. She brought food, said prayers, reminded me I wasn't forgotten. I promised myself that if I ever could, I'd repay her kindness. I suppose that's why I kept coming. Luke's hand tightened around the edge of the porch rail. You've repaid it 100 times over, Clara. You've done more than I ever deserved. She smiled faintly. You don't owe me gratitude, Luke. I didn't do it for you. I know, he said softly. That's what humbles me most. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the air. Luke turned, studying her face, the strength etched in it, the traces of grief and endurance. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known, proud but gentle, weary yet unbroken. Clara, he said quietly, I don't know what my life was supposed to be anymore. All that wealth, all that travel, it feels empty now. I come here and somehow everything makes sense again. Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, but she shook her head. Don't say things you'll regret, Luke. You don't owe me your heart either. I'm not offering out of debt, he said firmly. I'm just telling the truth. The wind carried silence between them, soft and trembling. She looked away first, gathering her sewing into her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. Then the truth is dangerous. People like you and me, we live in different worlds. He leaned forward, his tone tender but sure. Maybe it's time those worlds met. But before she could answer, the sound of his mother stirring inside broke the spell. Clara rose quickly, clutching her shawl. Good night, Mr. McAllister. Luke watched her walk down the path, her figure swallowed by the darkness. He knew what he felt, and he knew it would change everything, if only she'd let it. The quiet peace that had settled over the McAllister ranch didn't last long. Word of Luke's decision to stay in Red Willow, turning down a lucrative cattle deal in Denver, reached his business partners in the city. Within a week, 2 of them arrived on a dust-covered carriage, their polished boots and silk coats looking absurd against the rough prairie wind. Luke had known their visit wouldn't be pleasant. Mr. Grayson and Mr. Teller were men who measured worth in gold, not goodness. They found him in the barn, sleeves rolled up, helping repair a fence post. Good Lord, Luke, Grayson scoffed. You look more like a farmhand than a man of means. Luke smiled faintly, setting down the hammer. Maybe that's what I needed to remember. They exchanged glances, and Teller's tone hardened. We heard strange things from town. Rumors about a woman, a widow who's been seen around here. I trust you haven't forgotten your name carries weight. Luke's eyes narrowed. If you're here to talk business, talk. Leave my personal life out of it. But they didn't. They never did. Grayson leaned against a post. We've invested years into your enterprises. You're the face of our brand, Luke. A man of status, educated, polished, respectable. If you start parading around with a poor widow, nursing your parents and fixing fences, what message does that send? Luke felt a flash of anger rise. It sends the message that I'm a man who remembers where he came from. Don't be foolish, Teller said coolly. You think charity makes you noble? It makes you vulnerable. This woman, Clara Hayes, isn't it? She could destroy your reputation. One whisper. One scandal, and every investor will think you've lost your edge. Luke's jaw clenched. Clara Hayes is the only reason my mother's alive today. She's shown more decency than anyone I've ever known, Grayson sighed, folding his arms. All the more reason to help her quietly. Set her up somewhere safe, away from here. Pay her enough to keep her comfortable, but keep your distance. It's better for everyone. For a moment, Luke just stared at them. Their words echoed in his head. Pay her off, send her away. It was the same cold logic he'd once lived by. But now, standing on the land where he'd been born, looking toward the house that still held his parents' laughter, it all felt hollow. He stepped closer to them, voice low but firm. You think she's after money? That woman has turned down every cent I've tried to give her. She doesn't want anything from me, least of all charity. Teller's lips twisted in a smirk. Then she's smarter than we thought. Makes her look even better to the gossipers. Luke's temper snapped. He grabbed the man's collar and shoved him against the post. Say another word about her, and you'll regret it. Grayson raised his hands quickly. All right, Luke, all right. But think carefully. You have more to lose than she does. Luke released him, breathing hard. No, he said quietly. You're wrong. If I walk away from her now, I'll lose everything that actually matters. That night after the partners left, Luke sat alone on the porch, the stars stretching endless above him. His mother's soft breathing came from inside, and in the distance, he could see the faint light from Clara's cabin. He thought about the life his partners wanted him to return to. Meetings, profits, luxury, and it all felt suffocating. Then he thought of Clara's hands, steady over a bowl of soup, her laughter when his mother smiled again. In that moment, he made his choice. He would no longer live for the world's approval. He would live for what was right, no matter the cost. Tomorrow, he would make that clear, to everyone, and especially to her. The next morning dawned pale and cold, a thin layer of frost silvering the grass outside Clara's cabin. She had woken early, as she always did, preparing breakfast for the McAllisters before tending to her own small garden. But something in the air felt different, charged, uncertain. She didn't know that Luke had been awake all night, pacing his porch and wrestling with the choice that would change both their lives. By the time he arrived at her door, the sun had just cleared the hills. Clara opened it, surprised to see him standing there without his usual hat, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Mr. McAllister, she greeted cautiously. Is everything all right? He nodded once, though his jaw was tight. May I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The small cabin smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, warm despite the cold outside. He took in the tidy room, the rocking chair by the hearth, the little table with 2 cups, the cradle tucked quietly in the corner, still holding the memory of her lost child. Luke removed his gloves, holding them loosely in one hand. Clara, he began, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, 2 of my business partners came from Denver. Her hands froze over the kettle. Business partners? They came to talk me out of staying here. They think this place, this life, is beneath me. They think you're beneath me. The words struck her like a slap, though she tried not to show it. They're not wrong, she said after a moment. You're a man of means, Luke. I'm just... Don't, he interrupted sharply. Don't finish that sentence. He stepped closer, voice low but steady. I've spent years letting people tell me who I'm supposed to be. I've worn their suits, made their money, lived their way. And it all meant nothing until I came home and saw what real goodness looks like. Her breath caught. Luke, he shook his head, his expression softening. I told them I was done, that I wouldn't sell my soul to keep their respect. They offered me everything, power, comfort, more wealth than I could ever use. But I told them I'd rather be here, with my family, with you. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Clara's eyes glistened, but she looked away quickly, busying herself with the teapot. You don't mean that, she murmured. You're grateful, that's all. When your parents recover, when business calls you back, you'll forget this feeling. And you'll forget me. He reached out, gently taking her hands in his. I could forget everything else, Clara, but not you. She trembled under his touch. You can't say things like that. People will talk. They already do. Let them, he said quietly. Let the whole town talk. I won't hide the woman who saved my family. Her voice broke, a whisper torn from her. You don't understand. I've already lost once, Luke. My husband, my child, my place in this world. I can't lose again. He looked at her then, eyes full of something deep and aching. Then don't lose me. Don't push me away. The kettle began to whistle, shrill and insistent, but neither moved. Her tears fell silently, and he let go of her hands, realizing that love, no matter how true, couldn't be forced. Finally, she spoke, her tone trembling but resolute. You have a kind heart. The days that followed were a blur of silence and longing. After Luke walked out of Clara's cabin that cold morning, the two kept their distance. She still came to care for his parents, but she spoke little, her eyes downcast, her visits shorter each day. Luke watched her from afar, torn between honoring her words and defying them. The ranch that had once felt alive with her laughter now seemed haunted by her absence. Winter began to melt into spring. The snow receded from the hills, and the meadows began to bloom. Luke's mother grew stronger, often sitting by the window waiting for Clara's familiar silhouette. But Clara's steps had grown hesitant, her spirit heavy with what she had refused. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Luke had been out riding the north fence when he saw smoke curling against the sky, not from his house, but from the woods near the old well. Without thinking, he spurred his horse forward. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of burning wood became. His heart hammered in his chest. When he reached the clearing, his worst fear met him. Clara's small cabin was half consumed by flames. He leapt from his horse and ran toward it, calling her name. Clara, Clara. Her voice came faintly from inside. Luke! Without hesitation, he threw his coat over his face and pushed through the door. Smoke stung his eyes as he found her trapped beneath a fallen beam. He lifted it with all the strength in him, coughing hard, and pulled her free. Her arm was bruised, her hair singed, but she was alive. He carried her out into the fresh air just as part of the roof caved in behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Clara clung to him, gasping for breath, her face pressed against his chest. You fool, she whispered weakly. You could have been killed. So could you, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I'd lost you. The flames roared, devouring the last of the little home she had built. All her possessions, the few memories she'd kept of her husband and child, were gone. She watched in silence, her eyes reflecting the fire's orange glow. Luke wrapped his arm around her shoulders. You'll stay at the ranch now, he said firmly. I won't hear another word about it. She shook her head. Luke, I can't. Yes, you can, he interrupted. You have nowhere else to go, and I have nowhere I'd rather you be. She looked up at him then, eyes shining with tears. Why do you keep doing this? She asked softly. Why won't you let me go? He exhaled slowly, the truth finally rising from the depths of everything he'd been holding back. Because I love you, Clara. I tried to tell myself it was gratitude, admiration, anything but love, but I can't lie anymore. You've changed everything. You've changed me, her lips trembled. And if I stay, then we'll build something new, he said. Together. No more hiding. No more shame. For a long moment, the world was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind. Then slowly she leaned her head against his chest. You'll regret it, she murmured, half smiling through her tears. He brushed a lock of soot from her face. Not a chance. By nightfall, the neighbors had come to help. The McAllisters opened their doors to Clara without hesitation, calling her family. Luke's parents, once frail and quiet, looked at her with warmth and gratitude deeper than words. Weeks later, when the land had turned green again, a new cabin rose near the main house, stronger, brighter, filled with laughter instead of ghosts. Clara planted lilacs by the porch. Luke helped her mend the fence lines, his hand brushing hers more often than by accident. And though the town still whispered, it no longer mattered. Because when love burns through the walls of fear and pride, it leaves only truth standing, and the truth was this. The widow who once hid in the shadows had become the heart of the ranch, and the millionaire who once lived for the world's approval had finally found his home. Luke. But kindness isn't enough to build a life on. Go back to your world before you burn this one down for me." He stood there for a long time, the words hanging heavy between them. Then slowly he nodded. "If that's what you want." But as he walked out into the cold morning, neither of them believed it. Because sometimes love demanded the very thing both feared most, a choice neither could take back.